Hi guys, welcome back. My name is Erica and this is True Crime in Politics, a show where I document some of the absolutely horrific things that US politicians do, both at home and abroad, by treating them like any other criminal and making them the topic of a true crime documentary. If you have not yet watched part 1 of this series on George H.W. Bush, I implore you, go back and watch it now. But, whatever. You do you. Either way, I will link it in the description, as well as all of my sources, so that you can see I am really, truly not making this up. Let's go. In 1976, George Herbert Walker Bush became the new director of the CIA. Now, clearly the CIA is a very powerful institution, but in 1976, it was shaken to its core. Remember, we learned in part 1 that congressional investigations carried out by the Church Committee had really exposed the agency's sordid past. We're talking disgusting human experiments carried out on US citizens without their permission, and chemical and biological weapons being made without the approval of Congress, and also coup and assassination plots aimed at deposing leaders around the world. I mean, in short, HW was given the impossible task of reinvigorating this disgraced agency while under severe scrutiny by the entire world. George was marketed as a complete outsider to the intelligence community, and therefore somebody who could come in like unburdened by this culture of lies and malfeasance, which had seemingly been bred into the secretive and nefarious organization. HW was meant to restore relations with elected representatives on Capitol Hill by providing them transparency into the secretive organization for the first time in CIA history. The assignment was clear. George H.W. Bush was to reform the broken agency and also restore morale to the agents. Spying and experimenting on U.S. citizens would cease, as would a CIA foreign policy that sought to undo democracy when convenient, both at home and abroad. After only 1 year as CIA chief, George Bush was heralded as the savior of the organization. And later on, CIA headquarters at Langley, which was previously unnamed, would be christened the George Bush Center for Intelligence. Unfortunately, we now know that Bush didn't really reform the CIA. I mean, he certainly did not get rid of the covert crimes, and he definitely did not tell Congress about everything that took place under his watch. In fact, perhaps the most sweeping and disgusting program of human brutality ever to be sponsored by the CIA was formalized and brought to full force while HW was the head of the agency. Of course, perhaps that is to be expected, given that the entire premise for his appointment was a lie. We learned in part 1 that George had been involved with the CIA for decades before embarking on his political career. And we also learned that George's dad, Prescott Bush, was similarly deeply tied and involved with the CIA through his very good friend Alan Dulles. And we also learned that Dulles, well, he was the man primarily responsible for making the CIA into the wretched criminal cohort it was found to be by the Church Committee. So it never really made sense to have HW be the guy to come in and fix it, did it? But in order to understand why, when George was under the utmost public scrutiny and had his entire political career on the line, he would risk it all to continue the legacy of Alan Dulles' monstrous CIA, we need to understand a little more about U.S. history. We need to understand the entitlement and the imperialist notions that shaped the philosophies of men like the Dulles brothers, Prescott Bush, and later George H.W. Bush. And to do that, I think we should run it all the way back to H.W.'s ancestors as they stepped off the frickin' Mayflower and into what they referred to as the New World. Manifest destiny is an idea that emerged in the early settler colonial days of the United States, and it was used to justify the rapid expansion of U.S. borders. This was the belief that American values, by which they meant the values of the white people colonizing the Americas, but whatever. In any case, they believed that their values were destined to be spread because their special virtues would redeem and remake the West. Like most colonizers who came before them, U.S. colonialists enjoyed the belief that they were bringing light and civilization where before there was only darkness and savagery. But of course, seizing all of the land from sea to shining sea required waging many bloody and entirely unnecessary wars, as well as the constant betrayal and slaughter of indigenous Americans, which can only be summed up as genocide. But this fact did not prevent the European colonizers from thinking of themselves as the hero of that story. And unfortunately, the underlying principles of manifest destiny did not simply end with the expansion of U.S. borders. The idea that the lives and customs and culture and technology of European Americans was so important and inherently valuable that it justified the annihilation of the lives, customs, and cultures of Native Americans, that general sentiment never really diminished. Instead, what happened was it spread south. So this expansionist colonial philosophy morphed into a national policy of imperialism. One result of this political mutation was the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that the Americas, North and South, were not to be interfered with by anybody outside of the Americas. Now, at first glance, this policy does not seem particularly odious. Most of South America had united behind the leadership of Simón Bolívar and ousted their colonial oppressors from Spain not long after the U.S. had won its war for freedom from Great Britain. And so, at first, this declaration by the United States that Europe and the whole rest of the world needed to keep their hands off these two recently liberated continents may have seemed like an act of camaraderie. But it wasn't. It was not an act of camaraderie. While the Monroe Doctrine certainly did call for the rest of the world to keep their hands off of North and South America and everything in between, it was certainly not a call to respect the sovereignty of the nations of the New World. Instead, it declared that only countries in the Americas would be allowed to exert influence in the region, which meant that the United States of America would be allowed to dominate and dictate policies across both continents with force when necessary. You see, by this point, Europe had already colonized all of Africa and much of Asia, and Russia had a giant empire as well. And the United States, well, she wanted to grow up big and strong like her European imperialist role models, and so she staked her claim on all of the New World. The Monroe Doctrine was very much so the dibs-its-mine approach to foreign policy, and it just so happened to blend very nicely with the old notions of manifest destiny. So this new doctrine resulted in persistent attempts by the United States to dominate and control all of North and South America and every damn island in between. This led to a lot of U.S. military interventions on both continents as well as the Caribbean islands in what are now referred to as the Banana Wars. Remember in part 1 how the Dulles brothers overthrew the democratically elected president over in Guatemala, also that their friends and employers, United Fruit Company, could make mad profits off of cheap bananas by basically enslaving the local population? And do you remember when I said that this was just a continuation of a long-standing U.S. foreign policy? Yeah, well, that's because Guatemala was just the closing act of this long string of conflicts known as the Banana Wars. The U.S. spent several decades between the Civil War and World War II creating a whole lot of fascist dystopias or banana republics, just like the one we learned about in Guatemala. Look at this map. The U.S. intervened in these 10 countries nearly 50 times, both to demonstrate its military capabilities to the rest of the world and to grow its economy. This was an era of overt imperialism by the United States, and it was during this time that Central and South America came to be referred to as America's backyard by U.S. officials. The U.S. government pretty much openly admitted that the violent repression of its neighbors to the south was about as routine as a property owner trimming his hedges or mowing his lawn. But then World War II rolled around, and it really changed the way the world viewed this sort of imperialism. You see, the Nazis, well, they also believed that they just had some very special virtues that were destined to be spread. Oops. So, old imperialist notions like the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny had to go after World War II. Thank God, right? I mean, it was just a little too obviously hypocritical as well as dangerous to keep selling those talking points after Hitler's brand of imperialism had just cost the world tens of millions of lives. But this is where the Cold War comes in. The decades-long war between the United States and the Soviet Union started almost as soon as World War II ended, and with the Cold War came a brand new doctrine, the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. vowed to fight against communism and authoritarianism all across the globe and to promote the superior, more virtuous ideologies of capitalism and democracy. Now, of course, the Cold War raged on all over the world, but the U.S. did have a special area of focus in her fight against communism. Can you imagine where that might be? Yep, Latin America. The U.S. changed her policy once more. Instead of saying it is our right and our destiny to control all the land in North and South America, basically because we're better, smarter, and stronger. Two, well, this was clever. It is our duty to stop the spread of communism and authoritarianism and promote the superior, one might say, more virtuous ideology of capitalism, especially in our own backyard. The fight against communism became the United States' new excuse to dominate and control her neighbors to the south. But in spite of her official stance against authoritarianism, it turned out her fight against communism and for capitalism, ended up partnering her with a whole lot of very questionable bedfellows. Throughout the Cold War, Lady Liberty, she definitely had a type. She liked herself some strong men, pro-capitalists who were unafraid to rule with an iron fist. Because it turns out, she loved herself some authoritarians, just so long as those authoritarians loved capitalism. And wouldn't you know it, as luck would have it, right-wing dictatorships just started springing up all over her backyard. And the United States was just thrilled to offer her assistance to the new regimes. Of course, it was a little awkward for Lady Liberty to justify support for all of these dictators who had just overthrown democratically elected presidents, but at the end of the day, she was just like, they're fighting communism, we're fighting communism, of course we're allies. Naturally, some found these alliances a bit distasteful, but overall, U.S. citizens were level-headed and they accepted this because they were terrified that the Soviet Union was literally taking over the world. I mean, those Soviets were out there just snatching up and taking over country after country after country, and, well, the United States, she was only forming alliances, right? The difference was glaring. The Red Army was out there simply usurping power, and the United States, she was just making alliances with people who had usurped power. Unfortunately, that narrative was upended by the Church Committee findings. Congressional investigations carried out by the Church Committee had shown that at least some of Lady Liberty's relations with those dictators, well, they'd happened in the dark. And what went on there had been much filthier than anyone had imagined. Okay, stretched that analogy far enough, I think. Thanks to the Church Committee, U.S. citizens found out that the CIA was responsible for orchestrating at least some of the coups in Latin America that ended with right-wing dictators taking over the government. And what's worse, in some cases it appeared that the CIA actually preferred right-wing dictators friendly to U.S. interests above, democratically elected leaders. Rather than stopping her imperialist practices of yore, it appeared that the U.S. had continued to dominate her neighbors to the south with the use of covert action. So, when H.W. was made CIA director in 1976, there were U.S. citizens arguing about the morality of this issue on, every corner. I mean, 'cause for real, how, again, does it promote American values to topple democracies and replace them with dictatorships? If there was a poster child for anti-CIA sentiment in 1976, it had to be Augusto Pinochet of Chile. Church Committee investigations had demonstrated the unambiguously horrifying behavior of the CIA in Chile during the 1960s and 70s, and that had led to the rise of this malicious dictator. And for the first time ever, the American public had a detailed account of a good old-fashioned American coup. The coup in Chile that put Pinochet into power had redirected U.S. attention to U.S. Latin American relations right at the time that George H.W. Bush was being sworn into office. So if we want to understand the political climate of that time, we need to understand the mechanics of that coup. In case you didn't know, the hippie movement of the 1960s was not confined to the United States. It was a global phenomena, and Chile was no exception. The idea of free love, the focus on art and music, and the smoking of copious amounts of marijuana. Yeah, all that shit was real popular among young Chileans. And they even had their own version of Woodstock. It was called El Festival de Piedra Roja, and it took place in 1970. At the same time that the hippie movement was rocking its way through Chile, there was a socialist politician on the rise there as well. And Salvador Allende, he didn't just travel in the same circles as other prominent leftists and politicians, but also with poets and artists. The dude was very close friends with the Nobel Prize-winning poet Pablo Neruda, and he was deeply admired by the celebrated artist and Ecuadorian national treasure Oswaldo Guayasamín. Meanwhile, Allende fought for things such as workers' rights, free school lunches, and universal health care. In fact, Allende was actually the first person to establish a system of universal health care in the Americas all the way back in the 50s as a member of Chile's Senate. Encouraged by his success, Allende actually ran for president 4 different times. Twice in the 50s, again in 1964, and then finally in 1970. With each run at the presidency, Allende became more and more popular, and as the hippie movement stormed its way through Chile, his popularity continued to soar. In fact, the official song for Allende's 1970 campaign for the presidency was called Venceremos, or We Will Overcome. It was actually written by a famous singer-songwriter and political activist from Chile named Víctor Jara. With the success of his theme song, Allende famously proclaimed, "There can be no revolution without a song." Unfortunately, even though Chile is thousands of miles away from the United States, officials in the US still considered it part of their massive backyard. And even though Allende was a fairly moderate socialist, officials in the US looked at his potential election as a threat to the principles of capitalism. So they set out to stop him by any means necessary. The CIA spent a full decade from 1964 until 1973 and millions of dollars doing everything in their power to prevent and then to sabotage the presidency of the socialist Salvador Allende in Chile. And the vast majority of their money and effort was spent on propaganda. The CIA wormed its way into broadcast stations across the country, and they blasted anti-Allende propaganda from almost every TV and radio station in Chile. And simultaneously, they managed to infiltrate damn near every newspaper in the country. They paid more to El Mercurio than any other outlet because El Mercurio is Chile's most frequently cited newspaper. You got to think of El Mercurio as like the New York Times of Chile. Anything they say, for better or for worse, is gonna be repeated by every other outlet in the nation. According to Church Committee findings, the CIA were placing editorials in El Mercurio almost every day. And as the Allende campaign really started ramping up, I guess the CIA actually just pretty much took control of El Mercurio's international news section. And the CIA propaganda campaign against Allende didn't actually end with just controlling the media within Chile, but the extent of their massive propaganda campaign is actually best highlighted by this stunt that they pulled after, spoiler alert, Allende won the popular election. According to the Church Committee, the propaganda machine included several components. Predictions of economic collapse under Allende were replayed in CIA-generated articles in European and Latin American newspapers. In response to criticisms of El Mercurio by candidate Allende, the CIA, through its covert action resources, orchestrated cables of support support and protest from foreign newspapers, a protest statement from an international press association, and world press coverage of the association's protest. In addition, journalists, agents, and otherwise traveled to Chile for on-the-scene reporting. By September 28th, the CIA had agents who were journalists from 10 different countries in or en route to Chile. This group was supplemented by 8 more journalists from 5 countries under the direction of high-level agents who were, for the most part, in managerial capacities in the media field. Primary observation? Boy, howdy does the CIA like its propaganda. I mean, the fact that they had agents working as journalists at outlets all over the world and often in managerial capacities, that's terrifying, because it means that no matter where you go, anywhere in the world, any newspaper you read may just be littered with CIA talking points and propaganda pieces. It makes me think of that famous quote that I once heard rattled off by none other than Denzel Washington.
If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed.
That is one handsome man dropping some hard and heavy truth bombs right there. But returning to Chile, this is a wild series of events that the Church Committee described right there. So the CIA paid millions and millions of dollars in their attempts to propagandize Chilean citizens against Allende, and the vast majority of those funds went to El Mercurio. Then, when Allende correctly called out El Mercurio, the CIA organized what may have been the largest scale gaslighting campaign in the history of planet Earth. Well, to that point anyway. So the CIA orchestrated a response from news outlets around the world where they already had CIA agents who were pretending to be journalists. Then they sent some of those fake journalists to Chile in order to protest Allende, and at the same time, those same fake journalists organized a global media campaign in order to cover their own fake protest. Damn. All of these shenanigans ensured that the whole world covered the CIA's big fake protest of Allende. And of course, this was done to make Allende look bad, to make him look like he was an opponent of freedom of speech, like he was trying to control the media, like he was demonstrating authoritarian tendencies before even taking office. But the reality was that Allende was just speaking truth to power, because it was the CIA that was in there trying to stamp out dissident voices, trying to control all of Chile's media so that they could push their agenda. So now you have a pretty good idea just how far the CIA went to control the airwaves and printed presses of Chile, and also, honestly, the world at large about Chile during this time. But there is just one more example I have to mention because it paints the picture of the extent of the CIA propaganda machine in Chile during this time. The CIA campaign against Allende went beyond just infiltrating every media outlet in the country that they could either bribe or worm their way into. At the same time, they also paid sign painting teams to paint propaganda murals on buildings throughout the country. These murals portrayed images of communist firing squads and other depictions of the dark effects of communism in order to scare the Chilean masses into rejecting a socialist president. Can you imagine just like walking down the street and there are building-sized paintings of guys with guns executing people everywhere you go? CIA went hard in Chile, and especially when you consider the fact that Allende wasn't even a communist. He was a socialist, who believed firmly in the principles of democracy and had actually done a lot of good for his country. The CIA had used very similar tactics to prevent an Allende presidency back in 1964, and they had succeeded. But somehow, despite the years of efforts and unending propaganda against him, Allende was more popular than ever by 1970. Luckily for the CIA, they had some big business partners who wanted to back their play. According to Church Committee findings, numerous U.S.-based multinational corporations worked with the CIA to ensure Allende's defeat. The Church Committee actually proved that U.S. elites worked covertly with the CIA to take down Allende so that they could protect their investments in Chile. Or, to put it another way, U.S. elites conspired with the CIA to bypass democracy in the United States and thwart it altogether in Chile because money. In case you don't fully understand why big business balks at socialist systems, let me explain the friction real quick. So, for starters, socialist policies often work to nationalize resources as well as important civilian infrastructure. The nationalization of public infrastructure is often politically popular because it can lead to cheaper prices on things like water, power, internet, and phone bills, because in this case, the government would be producing these things not for profit, but at the cost of production. Similarly, the nationalization of a country's resources is often politically popular because what that means is that the nation's buried treasure, so things like coal, oil, and precious metals, well, they can't be extracted away by foreign corporations, but instead that the country of origin will receive any of the wealth from those materials. These policies anywhere in the world can lead to multinational corporations having less opportunity to make money, because if any state actually succeeds in producing quality products that are cheaper than their for-profit competition, the corporations lose a lot of business. And if a country's resources are nationalized, well, that just means that no corporations have an opportunity to make money in that sector of the nation's economy. So, of course, multinational corporations loathe socialism. It impedes their capitalist objectives. Objectively. Back to Chile. So, one company that was caught red-handed helping the CIA to prevent the rise of Allende was ITT, or International Telephone and Telegraph, a US-based company that still exists today. Allende wanted to nationalize Chile's communications and make them state-run and not-for-profit. Now, ITT was a communications company, so they feared that this would cause them to suffer massive profit loss in the region. Therefore, ITT worked with the CIA against Allende in order to ensure that their business would remain profitable in Chile. But ITT, well, they were just one of many on the business side of the US CIA corporate alliance against Allende, which was organized by David Rockefeller's Business Group for Latin America. Of course, this group was comprised solely and exclusively of United States businessmen, and its board members included representatives from David Rockefeller's own Anaconda Copper, ITT, and PepsiCo. Now, I don't know for sure that the CIA was simply working on behalf of the corporations. This could have just been a matter of shared interests. But what I do know is either way, this isn't the way a democracy is supposed to function. This merger of state and corporate power actually flies in the face of everything the US is supposed to be and stand for. When a country's foreign policy is decided by a handful of rich people without the approval of its citizens, that indicates it's an oligarchy. When a country's foreign policy decisions are decided by a merger of state and corporate power, again, without the approval of its citizens, well, that indicates that it is a fascist government. At least according to the classical definition of fascism and the man credited with popularizing the term in the first place. You know him as Mussolini. In Chile, the CIA was either acting as a tool of the US oligarchy or as a fascist organization. It certainly wasn't acting as a democratic one. Now, later on, Edward Corey, who was the U.S. ambassador to Chile during this time, he referred to the CIA as an international debt collection agency and investment security force for U.S. business. Oh, good. I was worried for a second. Guys, it's not fascist, it's just an oligarchy. Returning to our story, Allende versus U.S. interests really had all the trimmings of a classic David and Goliath story. I mean, one lowly senator from Chile versus an entire team of wealthy corporations who just so happen to be backed by the most powerful country on earth. Now, regardless of your views on socialism, there has to be at least a little tiny part of you that's rooting for the little guy here, right? Well, don't worry. That man did not disappoint. Despite all of the years of paid propaganda and all of the money and power rooting against him for years on end, Allende still won the popular vote in 1970. Did the CIA and big business just hang their hats and go home? Oh, hell no. All that 7 years of paid propaganda, that was just the first act. I mean, come on, the CIA was totally prepared for this outcome. They had tons of operatives on the ground in Chile. They knew Allende was super popular. So, after Allende won the popular vote, the CIA and their big business partners prepared two separate plots to finally stop him. They planned a hard coup and a soft coup simultaneously. The hard coup plot was pretty straightforward. After a discussion with his former employers at Pepsi, Nixon instructed CIA Director Richard Helms to organize a military coup. Then the CIA provided tear gas and submachine guns to the coup conspirators in preparation for the violent overthrow of the newly elected president. The soft coup plot was just a little bit more complex, but basically Rockefeller's coalition of multinational corporations, they offered the CIA a whole bunch of money to just try to bribe Chile's Congress and get them to overturn the election. Now, this bribery plot was only possible because Allende had only won a plurality of the votes and not the majority. And this was because there were 3 different people running for president, which made it difficult for any one of them to win the majority or more than 50% of the votes. So instead, the winner was just the person with the most votes of the 3, or the plurality. The Chilean Constitution required Congress to vote between the top 2 candidates in this case. Now, historically, this vote had just been a mere formality because Congress had always just voted in the dude with the most votes because, you know, democracy. But the CIA, with generous donations from U.S. businesses, had raised oodles of cash so that they could bribe Chile's Congress to vote against Allende. John McCone, an ITT board member at the time, he had offered the CIA $1 million from ITT alone. If that name sounds familiar, it's because we met McCone in part 1. He was the CIA chief that replaced Alan Dulles after he got fired over the whole Bay of Pigs disaster. And then remember, McCone went on to launch his own disastrous anti-Castro program called Mongoose, probably with the help of both Prescott and George H.W. Bush. Yeah, that McCone. Long story short, 7 years of paid propaganda didn't work, so they decided to go ahead and rig that election more directly by bribing Congress to vote in a less popular candidate. The military coup, or Nixon's first option, it was attempted on October 22nd, 1970, and according to Ambassador Corey, it was launched due to a call to action by Pepsi to Nixon, who happened to be Pepsi's former lawyer. All these assholes are just one big happy family, aren't they? The Pepsi coup fell apart almost immediately, but not before the assassination of Chile's armed forces chief, Rene Schneider. And it turned out the murder of Schneider ignited so much public outrage in Chile, it ended up foiling their bribery plot. The Chilean public was so outraged by the assassination and the obvious coup attempt that the Chilean Congress actually backed off the bribes in fear of public backlash. So the CIA and big business were in such a fervor to stop Allende that they tripped over their own goddamn feet before they could cross the finish line. And so, on October 24th, 1970, Chile's Congress voted 153 to 35 in favor of Allende, and the world's first democratically elected socialist president was sworn in on November 3rd. Unfortunately, this story turned out not to be David and Goliath. It's actually more Terminator versus mere mortal, because the CIA and corporate America, they never stop coming for you. With Allende in power, the CIA's focus turned from trying to make him too scary to vote for to trying to make his government look so bad that the Chilean people would turn on him, maybe even rise up against him. In the 3 years of Allende's presidency, the CIA continued spending mad money on propaganda, but they also started funding opposition groups within Chile. At the same time, the US government coordinated a massive effort to put the squeeze on Chile economically. Declassified documents reveal that Nixon actually told CIA Director Richard Helms to make the economy scream. And so, by cutting off aid, denying credits, and working with financial institutions on Wall Street as well as U.S. corporations, the U.S. government ensured that the Chilean economy would grind to a halt. The amount of aid and loans available to Chile and Chileans fell from the hundreds of millions to only tens. Simultaneously, an invisible blockade descended on the country. Demand for Chilean goods fell seemingly overnight, and at the same time, many U.S. businesses started refusing to sell their products in Chile. Now, this strategy was particularly effective because there were key sectors of Chile's economy that were entirely dependent on the ability to purchase products made by U.S. corporations. Losing the privilege of a free market meant that Chile could no longer buy replacement parts and machinery that were necessary for mining copper and steel, pumping crude oil, generating electricity, or even having functioning vehicles. Naturally, decreasing Chile's ability to mine their rich natural resources was going to reduce the wealth of the nation drastically. But what was even more impactful was Nixon's resolve to drive down the price on Chile's most lucrative export, copper. We know that Nixon plotted to dump stockpiles of U.S. copper onto the world market in order to reduce the value of the resource internationally. And in Allende's first year as president, copper prices fell so steeply that Chile lost $200 million in exports, which was the equivalent of 1/5 of the total annual income that Chile received from exported goods. Meanwhile, buses, taxis, and 16-wheelers started going out of commission for lack of parts. And this didn't just mean that Chileans lost ease of travel. It also meant that semi-trucks were not making their regular deliveries, and that meant that Chileans were not able to access goods that were available. The rippling effects of the U.S. corporate attack on Chile created a scarcity of resources necessary for day-to-day life, and eventually food shortages became rampant across the country. This all came to pass precisely as U.S. Ambassador Corey had threatened prior to Allende's election. Not a nut or bolt will be allowed to reach Chile under Allende. We shall do all within our power to condemn Chile and the Chilean to utmost deprivation and poverty. Though we now know that the CIA worked with financial institutions and big business in order to bring Chile to its knees economically, the CIA propaganda mill continued its assault on Allende and of course insisted that it was his socialist policies that brought about the collapse. So, more insane amounts of gaslighting from the CIA. To add fuel to the fire, right-wing groups within Chile were given financial aid by the CIA in order to sponsor anti-government strikes throughout the country. It was chaos incarnate, as intended, and tensions grew so high that Chileans began to fear civil war. But instead, they finally got a successful military coup and a right-wing dictator. Augusto Pinochet led the violent overthrow of Allende's government on September 11, 1973, or as some call it, the first 9/11. Pinochet wasted no time in becoming a violent and repressive dictator. He immediately used his military to start rounding up anybody who supported left-wing policies or the now dead Allende. Pinochet converted Chile's national stadium in Santiago into a concentration camp the very day of his coup. And as many as 20,000 innocent Chileans were brought to that stadium to be tortured and or murdered. Meanwhile, the Chile Stadium, also located in Santiago, was also converted into a concentration camp following the coup. And there, the popular musician Víctor Jara, the one who had composed the anthem Venceremos for Allende's campaign, was tortured for several days before being executed by a hailstorm of machine gun bullets and dumped into the street. Survivors who had witnessed the torture of the famous folk singer at the stadium later reported that he defiantly sang his anthem, Venceremos, or We Will Overcome, while he was being beaten by Pinochet's army. All of this in a stadium where he had once played for thousands of adoring fans. The Chile Stadium was later renamed in memory of Víctor Jara. Needless to say, the gunshot that ended Allende's life also ended the hippie movement in Chile. The National Stadium was just the first of many concentration camps that were set up by Pinochet across the country, and tens of thousands of innocent Chileans would go on to be kidnapped off the street and brought to these camps to be subjected to torture and oftentimes death. Trigger warning. If you have any triggers whatsoever, any triggers, if there is any disgusting, terrible, up thing in the entire world that might trigger you, it's about to get mentioned in some way, shape, or form. So if you have triggers, this is your exit. But that is your one and only warning. You need to go right now. Okay, let's carry on. Torture techniques varied. Some were forced to mop floors with their tongues. Others were pinned down while their legs were run over by super heavy vehicles in order to crush their bones entirely. All experienced severe beatings, and most victims endured some form of sexual assault as well. Of course, this type of torture was worse among the women, but men also suffered sexual assault by other men as well as trained dogs. Various objects were inserted into the sexual organs of the victims to ensure maximum pain and suffering. These included spiders, rats, and other live animals. And forced incest was not uncommon as a form of both psychological and physical torture. Pinochet's regime was also especially fond of electrocution. They would tether their victims to metal bed frames or metal bed springs to ensure that the electric currents ran through the entire course of their victims' bodies. And they would focus the brunt of the electric shocks on the genitals and or open wounds in order to ensure maximum suffering. The atrocities that occurred in these concentration camps are very well documented, and as a result, there are many documentaries about them. So if you're interested in learning more about Pinochet's reign of terror, I will post some links below. By 1976, the Pinochet regime had been exposed for many of their awful crimes. Of course, the full extent of their depravity would not be known for many years, but Pinochet was getting a lot of bad press from human rights groups around the world. And the Church Committee findings pointed a long finger in the direction of both the CIA and US elites. So people were deeply concerned that an unelected portion of the US government had worked to topple a popular, democratically elected president and helped into power this sadistic madman, Pinochet. But discomfort with these facts was tempered with the appointment of a new and supposedly different leader in the intelligence community. On January 30th, 1976, George H.W. Bush was sworn in as the new director of the CIA. On that very day, the Condor Accord officially took effect. The Condor Accord was an agreement between right-wing dictatorships in South America to silence leftist sentiment across the continent by any means necessary. Condor countries included Bolivia, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, and Argentina, and later Peru and Ecuador, but those late joiners were never nearly so dedicated to the campaign as the other countries listed. Operation Condor got its name as a tip of the hat to the Pinochet regime's leadership in the program. The Andean condor is actually a majestic bird. It's a giant vulture, and it's the largest flying bird in the entire world. And it also happens to be Chile's national bird. Cool name aside, with Pinochet as its leader and role model, it should come as no shock that Operation Condor was a program of terrorism and violent repression. And Condor was backed by the CIA and supported by high-ranking US officials for its duration. To be clear, Condor had already informally begun prior to HW running the CIA, but it did not get into full swing until he was in charge. Also, the CIA did not run Operation Condor. They just, helped out where they could. Condor countries received technical support, military aid, and training from the agency. Like Pinochet, most of the Condor country dictators had come to power as a result of coups facilitated by the CIA. Now, thanks to the Church Committee, we have a much more detailed understanding of US involvement in the rise of Pinochet than the rest of these assholes. However, enough classified documents have been released at this point that I can show you the US was responsible for the majority of the coups that led to the violent military dictatorships that founded Condor. Don't worry, I'll be quick. The U.S. campaign against leftist leaders in Brazil started years before the coup in 1964, and this coup may have actually worked as a sort of blueprint for the coup in Chile nearly a decade later. The playbooks were so similar that even the detail of ITT leading the charge on the corporate side of the coup was almost perfectly mirrored. And just like in Chile, Brazil transformed from a democracy into a dictatorship overnight. Declassified documents show that the U.S. ambassador to Brazil at the time, Lincoln Gordon, had contacted the highest levels of the U.S. government, including the Secretaries of State and Defense and the head of the CIA, in order to request a secret weapons drop on March 31st, the day the coup began. In the same memo, Gordon advised that the U.S. Navy should be prepared to assist coup leaders if necessary. The coup is complete the following day, April Fool's, 1964. Lyndon Johnson celebrated the success of the coup. He immediately recognized the new far-right military regime as Brazil's rightful leaders and promptly renewed financial assistance to the country. The violent military regime remained in power until 1985. U.S. interference in Bolivia was a longer and even more gradual road to tyranny. The U.S. began their concentrated campaign to influence Bolivian policies directly following the Bolivian uprising of 1952. In the popular uprising, the National Revolutionary Movement, or MNR, as well as the Bolivian peasants, overthrew the oligarchy, redistributed the land, nationalized resources, abolished forced labor, gave women and peasants the right to vote for the first time, and made education free. Naturally, the U.S. felt the need to intervene. The U.S. infiltrated Bolivia in the old-fashioned way, quid pro quo. They offered Bolivia, the poorest country on the continent, financial assistance in exchange for specific economic policies. It began with allowing U.S. businesses oil and land rights, but then later this turned into wage freezes and union busting. But as the Bolivian ruling party continued moving right, it fell out of favor with the Bolivian people. And so, like Brazil, Bolivia actually lost their democracy to a coup in 1964. Now, the U.S. did not actively participate in the '64 coup, but many argue that they are the ones that paved the way for it. Political scientist Stephen Zunes wrote, "In the end, the U.S. was able to overthrow the revolution without having to overthrow the government." See, whether Bolivia was a democracy or a dictatorship didn't actually matter to the United States, because the U.S. was able to use its economic superiority to prescribe economic policy in Bolivia, regardless of whether it was run by elected presidents or the dictators that came after. That is until October of 1970, when Bolivia's military dictatorship was passed on to the socialist José Torres. Torres wanted to return to the early radical reforms of Bolivia's once revolutionary ruling party. Torres wanted to reclaim Bolivian land and resources and improve workers' lives. In short, he wanted the U.S. out of Bolivia. And so, just a couple months after Torres came to power, the Nixon administration freed up $400,000 to offer to right-wing coup plotters in Bolivia. On August 21st, 1971, with full U.S. support and financial aid, Hugo Bonsar overthrew Torres. Bonsar's violent and repressive regime lasted until 1978. The 1973 coup in Uruguay took on another form entirely. The U.S. had also spent years interfering in this country, but in the case of Uruguay, much of their work went into police reform. Not the good kind. There was a large left-wing movement in this country, and it was led by the Tupamaros, whose creative and peaceful protests had garnered a lot of attention and support. U.S. forces trained and equipped Uruguayan police to use torture as the main tool in combating such dissidents as the Tupamaros and their followers long before Uruguay descended into utter tyranny. The U.S. went on to encourage the rigging of the 1971 presidential elections in Uruguay against the Tupamaro-supported Frente candidate. Nixon is actually on the record saying, "The Brazilians helped rig the Uruguayan elections," and that there are anti-democratic forces at work which we are not discouraging. As a result, Juan Bordaberry was elected, and he was quickly given even more training in the fine art of torture by the US and even more weapons to use in his crusade. So later, when he dissolved Congress and made himself dictator, that was just an obvious next step, and the United States obviously supported him. So now, back to old George. He was busy getting sworn in as the new director of Central Intelligence at the very same time that the Condor dictators were finalizing their agreement to unite against all leftists and all dissidents in all of South America. The military forces of Brazil, Bolivia, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, and Argentina were preparing to take their right-wing authoritarianism to the next level by creating a multinational terrorist organization capable of targeting victims globally. But there was just one small problem. While the United States had managed to help Bolivia, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile graduate from democracy into dictatorship, and of course, Paraguay had long been secured under the heavy hand of U.S. ally and longtime dictator Alfredo Stroessner, Argentina was still a democracy. The military leaders in Argentina were absolutely gung-ho for Condor, but they were afraid that their president, Isabel Perón, was too weak to lead the country in this bold new direction. Had to go. By far, the most beneficial of U.S. assistance to Condor operations was the facilitating of another coup. With all of the pieces in place for a ruthless group of right-wing extremists to take control of South America once and for all, the U.S. gave the nod to the Argentinian military. It was time for the last domino to fall, and less than 2 months after George H.W. Bush was sworn in as the new director of Central Intelligence, Isabel Perón was overthrown in a military coup in Argentina that was supported and encouraged by the U.S. government. Declassified documents reveal that U.S. operatives worked with coup conspirators in Argentina in the weeks leading up to a military coup that replaced yet another democracy with a fascist military dictatorship. Hesitant coup conspirators were propelled forward by guarantees of U.S. support for their regime once the coup had taken place, and U.S. operatives even warned the coup plotters against trying to return to democracy too soon following the coup. Meanwhile, private U.S. companies were promised that the military junta would help advance their interests. Just like in Brazil and Chile, ITT was specifically mentioned as a likely beneficiary of the regime change operation. A CIA asset promised the corporation that Argentina's telephone company would be passed on to them following the coup. All of this taken together leaves no doubt as to whether the CIA helped facilitate the coup in Argentina, which took place just after Bush entered office. And in fact, George's own diary shows that he briefed President Ford on the coup 2 weeks before it took place. This was a ballsy move by HW, especially given that he was brought in to run the CIA under the guise of being a complete outsider. I mean, we know from part one that that is complete bullshit. But even with his long history as a CIA insider, the decision to help oversee this coup was incredibly bold. Bush was brought in the midst of a public outcry over CIA intervention in Chile and where it had led that country. As the fresh new face of the agency, he was expected to lead the CIA in a new direction and to prevent things like another Chile from occurring. But instead, he just immediately oversaw the formation of a similar regime right next door. This was a huge risk to HW's political future because he was, defying the will of both Congress and the American public. He was also doing it in a very big way because he knew that he was facilitating a coup in a country where the military leadership was even more extreme, far-right, and radical than that of Pinochet's regime in Chile. I know, after everything that I have shared with you about the human rights violations in Chile, you have to be thinking, well, there's just no way Argentina could turn out worse than that, right? Well, it did. And not only did it, but U.S. intelligence, i.e. George H.W. Bush, fully fucking knew just how bad conditions would become in Argentina following this coup. 2 days ahead of the coup, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was advised that the future dictator of Argentina, General Videla, would, quote, have to come down very hard, not only on the terrorists, but on the dissidents of trade unions and their parties. So basically, this head in Argentina was full on planning on treating people in unions like, United Auto Workers, United Steel Workers, or even the National Teachers Association, like they were f***ing terrorists. Furthermore, Kissinger was told to expect a fair amount of repression, probably a good deal of blood, in Argentina before too long. How did Kissinger reply? He said, whatever chance they have, they will need a little encouragement, because I do want to encourage them. Yeah, the unofficial U.S. stance was to applaud and encourage the bloody repression of everyday Argentinians. Now, being fully aware of the resounding backlash in the U.S. and globally over the situation in Chile, U.S. operatives did fear that the bloodthirsty nature of this new Argentinian regime would be discovered. Because if their campaign of terror was exposed, well, that would make it hard for the U.S. to fund it. Another memo to the same slithering scumbag Secretary of State, Kissinger, read, an Argentine military government would be almost certain to engage in human rights violations such as to engender international criticism. This could lead to U.S. public and congressional pressures, which would complicate our relations with the new regime. And so, rather than discouraging a coup that would lead to inevitable human rights violations, U.S. accomplices were asked to be extra careful to not get caught. And so there are several declassified documents that show many calls for U.S. operatives to go ahead and clear out of the country and avoid meetings with coup plotters in the days leading up to the military insurrection. The documents make clear that U.S. involvement in and knowledge of the coup were to be carefully hidden so that the U.S. could never be held responsible for the crimes they were encouraging. For those who don't know, a dirty war is conducted either by military forces or secret police against revolutionaries, which really just means anybody who doesn't fully commit to or support their regime, and it usually involves the kidnapping, torture, and murder of civilian populations. So, as predicted, the military coup in Argentina led to horrific human rights abuses. Directly following the coup, the military junta in Argentina began engaging in a dirty war against their population that was considerably worse and far more expansive than the atrocities being carried out in Chile. While Chile is estimated to have had about 24 torture and death camps, this new regime of Argentine fascists opened up 520 such camps in their country. And just to be clear, every disgusting thing that I talked about earlier that was going on in Chile, torture techniques varied. All experienced severe beatings, and most victims endured some form of sexual assault as well. Various objects were inserted into the sexual organs of the victims to ensure maximum pain and suffering. These included spiders, rats, and other live animals. And forced incest was not uncommon. They would tether their victims to metal bed frames or metal bed springs to ensure that the electric currents ran through the entire course of their victims' bodies. And they would focus the brunt of the electric shocks on the genitals and or open wounds. Yeah, all of that. And the coup in Argentina actually allowed for all of that hideousness to increase by more than 2,000%, if you're going by the number of concentration camps, that is. And George H.W. Bush, well, he was in charge of the only U.S. intelligence agency allowed to carry out covert action abroad at the time of that U.S.-assisted coup. And this coup did not just affect Argentina, because it radically hastened the pace of the cross-border kidnappings, torture, and executions carried out by Condor's fascist leaders across the continent. The new military dictatorship in Argentina opened the floodgates for Condor to soak all of South America in the blood of dissidents. And the Argentine fascists went on to help Condor excel to the most sweeping and disgusting set of human rights violations seen since World War II. I know that people really overuse the Hitler comp, especially these days, but trust me, in this case, it's actually appropriate. Later, Argentine government investigations discovered that its military intelligence officers advanced Nazi-like methods of torture by testing the limits of how much pain a human being could endure before dying. The totalitarian nature of the anti-communism gripping much of South America revealed itself in one particularly bizarre Argentine practice, which was used when pregnant women were captured as suspected subversives. The women were kept alive long enough to bring the babies to full term. The women were then subjected to forced labor or cesarean section. The newborns were given to military families to be raised in the ideology of anti-communism, while the new mothers were executed. Many were taken to an airport near Buenos Aires, stripped naked, shackled to other prisoners and put on a plane. As the plane flew over the Rio Plata or out over the Atlantic Ocean, the prisoners were shoved through a cargo door, sausage-like, into the water to drown. After the CIA had literally painted the threat of communist firing squads across Chile, they followed that up with helping the expansion of fascist death squads across the entire continent. Human experiments designed to maximize suffering and terror clearly cannot be justified as some evil necessary to stop a worse alternative. The US fight against communism in South America was obviously never in any way about stopping authoritarian regimes from laying waste to our neighbors to the south. This was about control. The US was expanding its sphere of influence in the same way that its communist enemies were over in Europe, and the only real difference was that US ideology and tactics aligned better with those of Hitler than Stalin. In fact, the ruthless anti-communist regime in Argentina somehow managed to make the Hitler Youth look less creepy. While both programs involved brainwashing children into a fascist ideology, the Argentine iteration contained this barbarous mutation where they also cut the babies out of the fucking womb, murdered the mothers, and then indoctrinated their children. Bush's CIA closely monitored Operation Condor from its inception, and the US government provided financial and military aid to the Argentine fascists as they expanded a network that was built to commit unspeakable crimes and unfathomable repression. While I was researching Operation Condor, I kept finding myself thinking about Nazis. Because, torture and death camps spanning an entire continent and stuff, well, that rings a bell from history class, no? And at the same time, I remembered that a lot of Nazis had fled to South America after World War II. Now, when I first made this connection in my head, I just said to myself, girl, have another wine, watch another episode of Dexter or whatever, and go to sleep. Because, come on, real live Nazis running death camps in South America in my lifetime? That's a little too much even for me to believe, right? But I couldn't shake the thought. So the next morning I started Googling around about it, and what do you know? Yeah, actual Nazis were assisting the Condor dictators alongside the US government. These parallels were more horrifyingly clear in the military's treatment of dissidents. The overcrowding, starvation, tortures, and general dehumanizing treatment of prisoners by the Condor dictatorships bore obvious similarities with the conditions of Nazi concentration camps. But it went beyond mere parallels. Argentine camps were suffused with Nazism, decorated with swastikas and portraits of Hitler, recordings of Nazi speeches ringing through facilities, prisoners painted with swastikas and forced to yell, "Hail Hitler," with especially sadistic tortures reserved for Jewish captives. Escaped former Nazis had, after all, been welcomed into Latin American military dictatorships, including the former head of Gestapo in Lyon, Klaus Barbie. Klaus, aka the Butcher of Lyon, He got that nickname as a result of his affinity for personally torturing his victims as the head of the Gestapo in Lyon, France. He is thought to have been directly responsible for the torture and murder of at least 14,000 people. After the war, the U.S. actually helped the butcher relocate to Bolivia, where the U.S. paid him as a CIA asset, and he managed to live peacefully in Bolivia for 33 years under U.S. protection. Klaus trained Bolivian militias in torture and interrogation techniques, and he became very good friends with the U.S.-sponsored Condor dictator Hugo Banzer. But Klaus was just one of many ranking Nazis that escaped to live happy lives in Condor countries. The notorious Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele, he's the dude responsible for all of the hideous experiments that made Auschwitz a household name. He was welcomed first to Argentina and then later was given Paraguayan citizenship by Condor dictator and U.S. ally Alfredo Stroessner. Turns out, Paraguay was actually the first country outside of Germany to develop its very own Nazi party. And Stroessner, well, he was himself of German descent, and he was just happy to help protect the vicious war criminal. But Nazi hunters did eventually come looking for him, so Mengele actually relocated one more time to yet another Condor country. Brazil took him, and he lived there happily in the countryside until 1976. Brazil also sheltered the White Death, Franz Stengel. Now, this guy worked on the Nazi euthanasia program designed to eliminate anybody with physical or mental disabilities, but he also ran the Nazis' second most deadly concentration camp, Treblinka. Stengel was welcomed to Brazil after the war, and he lived there peacefully for 16 years until his was finally tracked down by a Nazi hunter, at which point he was tried and convicted in the deaths of 900,000 Jewish people. Walter Roth is credited with building and then implementing the use of Hitler's gas chambers, which enabled the Nazis to systematically and expeditiously murder millions of Jewish people in furtherance of their final solution. Walter was welcomed to Chile, where he died peacefully at the age of 77, and both Chileans and Germans who attended his funeral chanted Heil Hitler at the ceremony. Meanwhile, a man who is credited with devising the policy of Jewish annihilation known as the final solution to the Jewish problem, Adolf Eichmann, he was just one of a plethora of Nazis who were welcomed into none other than Argentina. Of the estimated 9,000 ranking Nazis that escaped to South America after World War II, 5,000 of them settled and were welcomed into Argentina, and many were embraced by the right-wing military there, which means that these parallels between the Condor country concentration camps and those of Nazi Germany, this wasn't an accident. It was the result of purposeful imitation. And the sadistic torture techniques employed by the Condor countries were often taught to them by literal Nazis who had decades worth of knowledge and training in the most abhorrent and brutal torture techniques ever dreamt up by malevolent men. My first, perhaps naive question was, but did the US know they were empowering actual Nazis? The short answer Yes. The long answer, though, is more interesting. You may be aware that after World War II, the U.S. executed a highly controversial program called Operation Paperclip, where U.S. intelligence smuggled a whole lot of top-tier Nazi scientists into the U.S. to come and work for our government. The justification for this was basically that it was necessary to recruit those Nazis to our side because otherwise the Soviet Union would get them and then we would lose the nuclear arms race. Not a good look, but hey, these were scientists, not members of the Gestapo, not high-ranking Nazi militants, not the SS. Well, unfortunately, U.S. recruitment of Nazis did not end with Paperclip. At least 1,000 former Nazis were recruited to work for U.S. intelligence. And these guys weren't scientists. These guys were the Gestapo, they were the SS, and they were high-ranking Nazi officials. Turns out the U.S. did not want the skill sets of those Nazis to go to waste either. And even though the U.S. had fought alongside Russia and against Germany in World War II, well, the Cold War started just about as soon as World War II ended. Nazi military leaders had a whole bunch of experience killing Soviets. I mean, the Germans killed like 27 million brave Russian soldiers during World War II, and so that's how monsters like Klaus Barbie became paid members of U.S. intelligence. U.S. intelligence directed Hitler's former top Soviet spy master, Reinhard Gehlen, to start rebuilding his espionage circles in Europe. And that fool, he started recruiting the worst of the worst Nazis into his organization. According to one German newspaper, quote, Himmler's elite were having happy reunion ceremonies, end quote. For those who don't know, Himmler was the primary supervisor of Nazi Germany's genocidal programs. So that dude was responsible for the murder of 6 million Jewish people. Gehlen Org was responsible for helping thousands of ranking Nazis escape prosecution at Nuremberg by funneling them out of Europe through rat lines. Now, according to the Institute for Policy Studies, these fugitives often escaped Europe with a wink and a nod from U.S. intelligence officers. Unlike a lot of the scientists that were brought to the U.S. to work through Operation Paperclip, these guys that escaped through Gehlen Org and the rat lines, yeah, they are the exact sort of human garbage that you think about when you think about a Nazi. And those are the guys that escaped to South America. Juan Perón, who was the president of Argentina after World War II, he was directly involved in setting up those rat lines out of Europe in order to save those filthy Nazis from prosecution at Nuremberg. And so those rat lines ran directly from Europe to Argentina. And U.S. intelligence knew that. Meaning Kissinger knew that, and the head of U.S. intelligence, George H.W. Bush, definitely knew about the Nazi population in South America and that it was concentrated in Argentina. After all, it was naturally H.W.'s longtime family friend, Allen Dulles, who was at the forefront of the aggressive recruitment of Nazis into U.S. intelligence. And Allen, well, he was Gehlen Org's biggest supporter in the U.S. In short, George Bush and his CIA, and the U.S. government more broadly, well, they definitely knew that helping and encouraging the military takeover of Argentina's government would lead to Nazi-like oppression in South America. Put another way, George Bush knowingly and covertly aided, abetted, and supported the reemergence of Nazi practices. Again, Condor lies at the feet of many, many high-ranking U.S. officials. I mean, the juntas that made up Condor, they received technical support and military aid under Presidents Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. Many were even given direct training in the art of torture by the CIA at U.S. training facilities in Panama, known as the School of the Americas, which is a horrific institution that deserves its own video. But regardless of the length and the breadth of this long road towards fascism in South America, Condor would never have grown into the malignant behemoth that it became without the coup in Argentina. The floodgates of the operation flew open while Bush was in charge of the CIA, and his close relationship with those Argentine fascists, it continued and strengthened throughout his rise to power. We will get there, don't worry. As with any CIA-sponsored bloodbath, propaganda took a lead role in the story behind the Condor slaughters. Argentine coup plotters were specifically instructed to learn how to spin the narrative and to try to hide the bodies. A list of U.S. public relations firms was recommended by one of HW's CIA operatives to help the military junta to steer public opinion. The main goal of this PR firm would be to make sure that the Argentinian fascists were able to advance their regime of torture and terror, but without suffering the bad press Pinochet had attracted. Unable to cover up the fact that Condor was taking place altogether, the Condor dictators needed to come up with a story. They needed to spin a narrative that U.S. citizens, and the West generally, could get behind. You see, the whole reason that Argentinian military leaders were told to focus on this public relations campaign was so that the U.S. would be able to aid them in their regime of torture and murder without dealing with a public outcry back home. So the propaganda was intended for U.S. citizens. So the dictators went public about the war they were fighting, but rather than framing it as the hunting, kidnapping, torture, and murder of civilians suspected of free thought, which it was, instead they said that they were fighting a dangerous organization of left-wing terrorists. In yet another case of epic gaslighting, at the behest of the CIA, the terrorists went on the record to say they were fighting terrorism. And they wanted the whole world to know about their just cause. An important tactic for keeping up the facade of anti-terrorism was redefining terms. So Argentina's dictator Videla defined terrorism as follows. A terrorist is not only someone with a weapon or a bomb, but anyone who spreads ideas which are contrary to our Western and Christian civilization. Defining terrorism so broadly provided cover for the Condor leaders while they themselves rained terror down upon the entire continent. And given what we have learned about the CIA's global propaganda machine, I must assume that HW and his operatives played their part in promoting the propaganda pushed by Condor leaders. In turn, the U.S. government used this fabricated threat of extreme left-wing terrorists as a talking point to openly support the repressive dictators, and U.S. leadership constantly praised the Condor countries for doing what was necessary to stop the terrorist threat. And so many U.S. citizens applauded their government's support of this Nazi-inspired fascist terror network. Propaganda worked. Condor was a success. Now you might be asking yourself, but how did Argentina's dirty war not receive the kind of public global outcry that Pinochet's regime had. I mean, even with the US PR firms and the CIA working overtime to spin that narrative, it would be pretty hard for a regime to build over 500 concentration camps without the world taking notice, right? Well, it wasn't just good PR. The tactics themselves shifted with the rise of fascism in Argentina. One academic paper that I read argued that Argentina's military dictatorship not only mimicked, but improved upon Nazi Germany's Holocaust. They did this by targeting individuals rather than openly targeting like an entire group of people. They did not just go out and round up dissidents en masse to haul them away for torture and death the way that Pinochet had done upon assuming power. And they didn't use beloved edifices such as Santiago's soccer stadium. They also didn't use these massive torture and death complexes that, their forefathers in Germany had used, like Auschwitz or Treblinka. Instead, their death houses were more covert, clandestine. They were hidden. Argentina innovated and they refined this strategy in order to hide the number of people being targeted and to make their holding cells impossible to find. Individuals were quickly and quietly kidnapped off the streets or even out of their own beds. They were tortured in undisclosed locations, and when they were murdered, their bodies were disappeared into mass graves, mass burn pits, or by being dumped into the ocean. These tactics made it difficult for anyone to, point their finger in any given direction. It was impossible to say, at this time, in this place, this group of people was taken to this location. Instead, individuals just disappeared, one by one. And in many cases, they were never seen again. Imagine one day your brother disappears, and then your uncle, and then your mother. And nobody knows where they went, if somebody took them, or why. Even to this day, it can be very difficult to get the police to work with you when someone just disappears and there is no sign, symptom, or evidence to explain it. Now imagine that you suspect the police themselves are responsible, but you have no way to prove it. And you're concerned that if you even breathe a word about these suspicions to anybody, you may just suffer the same chilling fate. Now imagine this is the state of almost every other person living on the same continent as you. These people had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no one they could trust to turn to. These tactics were adopted across the Condor coalition, and los desaparecidos, or the disappeared people of the Condor dictatorships, they're still memorialized across South America to this day. These were people, hundreds of thousands of people who had friends and families and jobs and things to look forward to and futures in front of them until they were abducted and tortured and oftentimes murdered, all with the complete approval of US officials, including CIA Director George H.W. Bush. Because so many simply disappeared one day, never to be seen again, and this program went all the way into the 1980s, some of their family members are still searching for them to this day, even if it's just to recover their dead bodies so that they know what happened. And there are people who survived, who are alive to this day, who underwent unspeakable torture at the hands of Nazi fanboys who were supported by the US government and assisted by HW's CIA. Because these regimes were so good at hiding the bodies, the number of victims from Condor operations is still unclear to this day. But some estimates are as follows. The dead numbered 300 in Uruguay, 600 in Bolivia, 1,000 in Brazil, 2,000 in Paraguay, 10,000 in Chile, and 30,000 in Argentina. But some estimates for total Condor murders go as high as 80,000 people. So that would drastically increase all of these numbers. And in total, about 400,000 innocent civilians were abducted and tortured by the Condor dictatorships. I just have one final point to make regarding HW's specific involvement in Condor. So in September of 1976, the Condor countries signed a new agreement called the Teseo Regulation Operations Center, and this was meant to bring Condor global. So from here, they would begin performing assassinations in Europe and even in the United States. HWCIA had full knowledge of this agreement, and the same month that it was signed, one of Allende's highest-ranking officials prior to the Chilean coup, a man named Orlando Letelier, he was assassinated with a car bomb in Washington, D.C. This was the first ever terrorist bombing in the U.S. Capitol, and it was masterminded by a paid CIA asset named Manuel Contreras. Now, Contreras, he was the head of Chile's secret police and Condor operations under Pinochet. It is now known that George H.W. Bush personally worked to cover up the role of his asset and the Condor conspiracy that led to this assassination. So George H.W. Bush lied to Congress and the American public about a terrorist bombing that occurred in the U.S. Capitol to cover for his Condor cronies. As soon as Jimmy Carter became president, so January 20th of 1977, George Bush was relieved of his role as Director of Central Intelligence, which makes sense because Carter had built his platform on human rights, especially in regards to U.S. foreign policy. Clearly, Carter was aware that George Bush and human rights were incommensurate. And Carter even went on to sign legislation mandating a halt to all military aid, training, and arms sales to the fascist government of Argentina. Unfortunately, Jimmy would only serve one term as president before he lost to Reagan and Bush in 1980. And one of the first things that the Reagan-Bush administration worked on after they gained the White House was restoring military ties to Argentina, and also weakening or overturning any pesky legislation that prevented them from providing military assistance to the fascist regime that George H.W. Bush 1,000% knew was running hundreds of concentration camps modeled after those of their Nazi heroes. So today was just one big history lesson on U.S. imperialism in the Americas. Now, obviously, this began with the push to expand U.S. borders from sea to shining sea, which of course resulted in the genocide of indigenous Americans. We learned how European Americans justified that genocide with the concept of manifest destiny, or the idea that they, the white colonizers, were just inherently far more valuable than any of the people living in the Americas before them. We learned that that same basic ideology persisted during the years of direct imperialism in Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean during the Banana Wars. And then finally, we learned that even after imperialism was officially denounced by the US government, that it unofficially continued through the CIA and covert actions in Latin America. Most importantly, and most relevant to the story at hand, we learned about the modern-day climax of US imperialism in South America, Operation Condor. And while Condor lies at the feet of too many US officials to count, we did finally learn why it is essential to the story of George H.W. Bush. After all, George was in charge of the CIA when the coup in Argentina took place. And we know he knew about it, and we know that his operatives helped advise the coup plotters, and we know that it was that coup which enabled the scope of Condor operations to become so broad, so devastating, and so fatal. And we know that US intelligence was fully aware of the Nazi influence permeating South America, and that it was concentrated in Argentina. These guys knew of the horrors that would occur after a military coup occurred there, and they encouraged it. Estimates surmise that somewhere between 50 and 80,000 people were murdered by the Condor dictators, and the vast majority of those deaths are attributed to HW's friends in Argentina. And the sheer number of torture centers in Argentina, 520 of them, remember, well, that would indicate that the vast majority of the 400,000 total victims of Condor atrocities experienced their suffering at the hands of the Nazi-loving fascists in Argentina. It's one thing to know that the CIA has this historic tendency to enable right-wing dictators because those fellas tend to allow US elites to raid their country's resources. I mean, that's bad enough, right? But then we learn that the extremes of their affinity for fascism actually led them to allow and encourage a bunch of neo-Nazis to take over an entire continent. That's next level. US leadership encouraged, funded, and armed the Nazi-influenced Condor terrorists. And the CIA, well, they just helped train and advise them and kept scrupulous notes on every detail of their actions for Condor's duration. But we should never forget that the man that they chose to be the head of US intelligence as this massive plan culminated was the rich, old money, East Coast elite, George H.W. Bush. Guys, there's no way that's an accident. Do y'all remember Poppy's daddy, Prescott Bush? And do you remember how we learned in part 1 that he did a bunch to help out the Nazis both before and during World War II, but that it was okay because he never had to actually pay any price for his literal treason because he was just such a well-connected fella? Remember, Prescott had all of those ties to weapons manufacturers who were working on nuclear weapons in the middle of the nuclear arms race, so the government's decision to go easy on him kind of made sense. But what about Prescott's elite circle of friends? I mean, why did they stick by him? I didn't have a chance to get into this during part 1, but now that we've reached such a Nazi-laden portion of this story, I feel like now's the time. The fact is, a great number of US elites aided in the Nazis' rise to power. And I know this is going to come as a great shock to you, but this circles back to the Dulles brothers. This time, John Foster Dulles takes center stage. Do you remember how the brothers worked for that law firm that, advised all the biggest, most powerful companies in the world and stuff? Well, John, he saw great potential in Germany, and he advised all of his friends to invest their money with the Third Reich. John helped Germany secure a whole lot of loans from US banks, and he also ensured Germany's leverage with the very nickel and chemical cartels that they used to build up their weapons arsenal and then develop the gases that they later used in their attempts to exterminate the Jewish race. Now, to be fair, much of that occurred before Hitler's rise to power, but John's relationship with Germany actually strengthened after the Nazi banner was raised. John wrote profusely in support of Hitler's Germany. He worked to rationalize the Nazi movement, and he painted the Nazis as misunderstood. And because some of the brothers' wealthiest clients wished to maintain their investments with Nazi Germany regardless of the political climate, well, John just decided to go ahead and drop some of his Jewish clients who happened to be suffering intensely under Hitler's authoritarian regime, rather than encourage big names like Standard Oil and General Electric to withdraw their investments from Nazi Germany. Of course, John was not alone here. Ford Motor Company, General Motors, IBM, Coca-Cola, and of course our good old friends at ITT. That was just a handful of US companies who decided to go ahead and keep their investments in Nazi Germany, regardless of the fact that the violent oppression of Jewish people had already begun. Oh, and this road goes both ways, because old Hitler, he found himself deeply inspired by US ideals such as Manifest Destiny and the genocide it brought with it. He marveled in 1928 about how white US settlers had, quote, gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler praised the US as the only state that had truly worked towards a primarily racial conception of citizenship. Because you and I both know that, especially back then, regardless of the 14th Amendment in the United States, black and brown people were not given the same rights as white US citizens, and that was truly inspirational to that homicidal maniac Hitler. And eugenics, or the idea that only the fittest people should be allowed to reproduce, well, that philosophy was actually a widely accepted US policy long before it was ever implemented in Hitler's Germany. And that ideology, eugenics, it was nurtured and grown by US philanthropies like the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the good old Harriman family. Remember them? As in Brown Brothers and Harriman? And the Rockefeller Foundation went on to actually fund a lot of Germany's research into the ultimately racist undertaking of cleansing impurities from the human race. So one of the most famously and fabulously wealthy US families of all time, the Rockefellers, helped pay German scientists to develop their super racist theory of a master race. And Mengele backed that whole angel of death fella. He was one of the scientists that was on the Rockefeller Foundation's payroll for a while. So, To recap, the bloody, racist history of the United States helped to inspire Hitler's Nazi philosophy, and then U.S. elites helped fund his rise, and that included some of the scientific backing to his master race theory. And then, when the Nazi Empire came crashing down, Allen Dulles was there to step up and try to save as many of those monstrous Nazi bastards as he possibly could by bringing them under the wing of U.S. intelligence and considering them allies going forward into the Cold War. Given all this kinship between U.S. elites and Nazis, and also U.S. elites and U.S. intelligence, and then, U.S. intelligence and Nazis, it occurs to me that it is a very fair question to ask, are there powerful factions of U.S. elites who are, and have always been, out and out fascists? Are all these authoritarian regimes that they have helped to gain power over the years actually just mirrors of their own ideology? And if that's the case, should U.S. citizens be scared that their fascist overlords will one day turn on them? I mean, the CIA and U.S. elites were happy to see an entire continent, and one that they considered to be their own backyard, under the control of violent, oppressive, terrorist dictators who were literally influenced and advised by actual Nazis. And by the way, there were U.S. citizens who were living in South America and ended up being assassinated by Condor dictators. In fact, the Chilean Supreme Court ruled that 2 U.S. citizens were murdered by Pinochet's forces in Chile at the behest of U.S. intelligence. Yeah, sure as shit, the CIA was like, we kind of want in on this. I mean, we have some annoying leftists down there that we could certainly do without. So they gave intel on their own citizens to the Pinochet regime. And then Frank Tarugi and Charles Horman were kidnapped, dragged to the National Stadium in Santiago, tortured, and executed. Furthermore, the terrorist bombing and assassination that took place in D.C., well, forget the fact that it was a terrorist bombing in the U.S. Capitol for a second, and just know that the Chilean target was not the only victim. A U.S. citizen died in the blast as well, and H.W. still covered for his pal Pinochet. Now that shows us that he, and likely U.S. government officials generally, condoned that shit, even on U.S. soil, even with U.S. victims. So it really does beg the question, would they support fascism in the U.S. if they had the chance? What if I told you that U.S. elites once planned their very own fascist coup right at home in the USA? True story. Yeah. The same elites who have historically used the CIA like it's the Pinkerton arm of their own personal global empires. The same people who invested in both Hitler and Mussolini and helped them raise their fascist armies. They also planned to overthrow FDR when his popular New Deal policies threatened the advancement of their wealth at home. In 1934, Marine General Smedley Butler testified to Congress that a group of wealthy American businessmen had formed an organization called the American Liberty League. And this organization was formed with the express purpose of overthrowing FDR and establishing a fascist regime, concentration camps included, in the USA. See, Butler was beloved by veterans across the country because he was a famous general and a two-time Medal of Honor recipient. So they picked him to lead a 500,000-man march of other veterans onto the U.S. Capitol to oust Roosevelt. Problem was, General Butler had realized in his retirement that his entire career had been spent further enriching wealthy Americans. Because before they had the CIA to do their dirty work, they just used the Navy and the Marines, remember? You see, Butler had been a war hero in the Banana Wars. Remember that period of overt imperialism by the U.S.? Yeah. So, Smedley, in referring to his career in the Marines, said of himself, "I was a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." Given that epiphany, Butler was the wrong dude to choose for that job, huh? But this badass, he cooperated long enough to learn the details of the plot as well as who was all involved in it so that he could report it to authorities. Then there was a congressional committee over the whole thing, and that committee found that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. To Butler's dismay, literally all of the names of the certain persons who collaborated on this proposed coup were redacted. So, again, literally no punishment, not even bad press for the powerful. Fortunately, some diligent journalists were able to compile a pretty damning list of involved parties by studying who formed the American Liberty League. Quote, "The League was headed by the DuPont and J.P. Morgan cartels and had major support from Andrew Mellon Associates, Pew or Sun Oil, Rockefeller Associates, E.F. Hutton Associates, U.S. Steel, General Motors, Chase, Standard Oil, and Goodyear Tires. And the League's money was all funneled through Union Banking Company and Brown Brothers and Harriman by Prescott Bush. Furthermore, and I quote, the plotters bragged about Bush's Hitler connections and even claimed that Germany had promised Bush that it would provide material for the coup." So, not to be alarmist, but I do think that there's a pretty strong fascist element among the elites who run our country. And yes, I do think that. I mean, for a lot of reasons, I think that they do run our country. I mean, poor people in the US are pretty clearly second-class citizens. I mean, for example, like, if we get charged with any crime whatsoever, we go to jail. And that's because we generally can't afford to pay bail. But then that just means that you're only innocent until proven guilty if you have money. Or what about this? What about the fact that the legal act of peaceful protest often lands us poors in the slammer? But apparently, if you're super rich, well, you can be found guilty of high treason by a congressional court, and you will not only receive no punishment, but you can go ahead and just have your name redacted from the record too, because that way you can maintain your social stature. Anyway, you might be wondering what this seemingly excessive review of all of U.S. history has to do with our main man, George. So let me tell you. It's because George was not just some random rich douchebag who was constantly thrown into positions of power by accident. He was a rich, old money East Coast elite. And that means that his family managed to make, keep, and continually expand their fortunes going all the way back to the very beginning of the U.S. empire. And that is actually pretty crazy when you think about it. Because U.S. history begins first with the genocide of indigenous Americans, and then with a bunch of rich white assholes building empires off the backs of black slaves. And after slavery ended, a bunch of those same dicks went down to South and Central America and the Caribbean and used the U.S. Marines to prop up a bunch of fascist dictatorships, basically so that they could breed a whole new class of slaves to help them expand their empires. Then the very same people planned a fascist coup right here in the USA, all to prevent us poor people from having access to things like the 40-hour work week, minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, Social Security. Oh, and let's not forget that they were very against the implementation of any sort of child labor law. And after their fascist coup at home failed, and after the world turned its back on the kind of imperialism that had allowed them to subjugate entire nations for the sake of corporate gain, well, then they pushed for the creation of the CIA. And then the CIA went on to carry out many more fascist coups for the sake of corporate gain. The fact that the U.S. government was crucial to Operation Condor's success was probably celebrated by these same people. Just as Prescott planned a fascist coup at home, supposedly backed by Hitler himself, well, George went on to facilitate a Nazi resurrection in South America. Way to make Dad proud, George. U.S. elites have never seen the Americas as continents full of diverse people and cultures with a right to self-determination and the pursuit of happiness. No. Instead, they have always viewed this entire hemisphere as a resource-rich playground full of savages in need of taming. Operation Condor was a tool that was carefully constructed over the course of decades by the U.S. to enforce the never-ending notion that the cultural, moral, and ethnic superiority of U.S. elites entitles them to seize control. It's a scary world when some of the most powerful people in it have long family histories of supporting fascist ideologies. How does that saying go? Psychopaths are born, sociopaths are made. My point is, George wasn't special. He was one in a long line of elite U.S. sociopaths. George was made for shit like Condor. And that is why George was chosen to run the CIA in 1976. Condor was just a new generation of an old U.S. tradition. It really goes all the way back to his Pilgrim ancestors. It's simple. Take what you want and kill anybody who stands in your way. But, with quite a bit of racism and terrorism sprinkled on top, if it helps the cause. Look, I did not start writing this to convince you that all US elites are fascist and we're all doomed. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that we should be more vigilant and that we should become increasingly more aware of historical facts, especially as current US leaders continue to update terms like terrorist and especially domestic terrorist to this day. Oh yeah, and if you are concerned that our main man George was not front and center enough in this episode, then you should really tune in next time, because you see, Operation Condor just acted like a learning curve for that depraved sociopath. So in the next episode, he's going to hook back up with his old pals in Argentina and make his own mini Condor in Central America. In the next episode, we are going to go on a deep dive into a convoluted mess of a scandal that includes more death, torture, concentration camps, coups, oh yeah, and lots of drugs. Yeah, we're going to get down and dirty with the Iran-Contra scandal, and I am gonna show you George H.W. Bush was at the heart of it all. See you then.